Have you ever heard someone say, "There's nothing else to be done"? Maybe a doctor, in a low voice, trying to sound technical, but unable to hide the weight behind the eyes. Or maybe a relative, in despair, whispering, "Now." Only a miracle. If you've ever been in that place, or love someone who is, then this video is for you. Because today, something will be sent to you. Sometimes, when everything seems to end, heaven decides to begin, but it starts in its own way. Not with noise, but with a word. Not with proof, but with promise. And that's exactly what an ancient psalm said. Long before any medicine existed, long before hospitals, long before the word impossible was invented. It is written like this, in Psalm 107 verse 20, "He sent out His word and healed them, and delivered them from death." Today, this word will be sent again, not as sacred text on paper, but as sound, as faith, as healing that enters through the ear and finds a home in the heart. Maybe you don't feel it now, but something has already begun. While you listen, healing is already moving. Stay with me until the end, because in the middle of this story, you will hear something that might be just another song, or it might be the touch that was missing, the word that comes when everything else had already said there's no more way. He didn't cry when he heard, nor did he ask, "How much time do I have left?" The only thing James could do was look at the ground, as if his eyes were searching for a place to hide his soul. The doctor spoke. Yes, explained terms, showed images, spoke of aggressive disease progression and low response to treatment. But James wasn't listening anymore. The words hit from the outside. Inside, only silence, a cold silence. Ruth, his wife, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand tightly. She wasn't the type to fall apart easily, but even she felt that something inside her chest had cracked, as if the heart had slightly fractured, without making a sound, but with pain. The walk to the car was longer than usual, not because the hospital was big, but because, with each step, James's mind felt heavier, and when they got in the car, Ruth started the engine but couldn't drive. They stayed there, in silence, she looking forward, he looking down. Only the sound of the engine and the slow breathing of two hearts trying to understand what it means to live when you lose control of your own story could be heard. "Do you want to try another doctor?" she asked. Without looking at him, James took a while to respond. "They've already said everything. Ruth and God." Silence, that hurt. Not because of the answer, but because there was no answer. The truth is, James was a man of faith, at least he used to be. He played guitar in church, prayed before meals, read the Psalms like someone warming themselves in the sun. But in recent months, faith had been swallowed by fear. And now, at that moment, he asked himself, can faith also get sick? Can it die before the body? That night was long. At home, Ruth barely slept. She sat beside the bed, watching James, who breathed with difficulty but didn't complain. She wanted to pray, but she felt her voice wouldn't come out, because pain, when it's too great, leaves no room even for words. So she did what she could. She stayed silent, holding his hand. It was her way of saying, "I'm still here." Even without understanding, the next morning, James was admitted. The progression of the disease was fast. The hospital became home. The bed became routine. The tasteless meals, the exams, the medications, the worried looks from the staff, all of it was now part of the new normal. The days started to feel the same. With every new exam, less hope, and with every new report, a new statistic. But no word of faith, no gesture that said, "This is not the end." And then, on a Sunday afternoon, with light coming through the window as if heaven wanted to make one last visit, James whispered something that broke Ruth's heart. "You don't need to stay here anymore. This isn't life anymore." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and responded with the strength that only someone who truly loves is capable of finding. "As long as there's breath, I'm staying, because you are still life, even if the world says otherwise." James cried for the first time, not because of the physical pain, but because, at that moment, he realized that someone was still believing for him, even when he no longer believed in himself. And maybe that was the beginning of change, because sometimes faith begins in the heart of the one sitting beside the bed. Sometimes healing begins with the one holding the hand of someone who already gave up, and the word that transforms everything hasn't arrived yet, but it's on the way. The room was the same. The diagnosis took, nothing had changed, but Ruth felt heaven was closer, as if something invisible was being sent. as if a silent answer was about to pass through the walls of that hospital. She just didn't know yet that it would come as a word, not as immediate healing, but as a promise, and that promise was about to become sound. It wasn't the pain that bothered James the most, it was the emptiness. He was waking up, looking at the white hospital ceiling, and feeling absolutely nothing. Not anger, not hope, not fear, just nothing. He had become a kind of shadow of himself. His eyes, once full of brightness when he talked about life, now seemed shut off, and even the words that used to come out gently were trapped, as if his soul had lost its breath. Ruth noticed everything. She saw the body of the man she loved, but it was as if his spirit had left before its time, and that, more than the diagnosis, tightened her chest. She tried to be strong. She smiled at the doctors, thanked the nurses, bought flowers for the room even, though James barely looked. She tried to keep some spark of normality alive, even in the midst of chaos, but inside her, a kind of silent pain was growing. On the third day of hospitalization, she went to the hospital chapel. Alone, she sat on the last pew, and stayed there, still, without praying, without crying, without saying anything. The place was empty. A Bible open on the altar, unlit candles, silence, a silence so deep, it seemed to mock her faith. "God, are you still there?" she whispered, almost voiceless. Nothing, no breeze, no feeling, no chill. She wasn't asking for miracles. She just wanted a sign, a word, a phrase, even an invisible gaze that said, "I see you," but it didn't come, at least, not in that moment. That night, she didn't tell James she had gone to the chapel. She thought he didn't need more disappointment. She preferred to hold his hand and say, only, "I'm here," as if that was enough to keep him anchored to life. On the fourth day, a nurse entered the room with a message. "Mrs. Ruth, there's a letter for you." At the reception, a letter, actually. It seems to be just a piece of paper. It was left with your name, but no sender. Ruth went down, intrigued. At the front desk, a young woman handed her a folded envelope. No stamp, no signature. Inside, a single verse, printed in large letters, on plain paper. He sent out his word and healed them, and delivered them from death. Psalm 107-20. She felt a chill run through her body. She read it once, twice, 3 times. It was as if those words had sound, as if they had been written with a voice, not with ink. But who had left that there, and why? Was it coincidence, or an answer? She returned to the room with the paper in her hands, not knowing what to say. James was sleeping, but even in his sleep, his expression was tense, like someone carrying a weight that can't be put down. Ruth sat beside him. She looked at his thin face, then at the paper, and then did something unexpected. She read aloud. He sent out his word and healed them, and delivered them from death. She paused and whispered, "This word is for you." She didn't know why she had said that, but deep down, something inside her believed, because that was all that was left. To believe, even without proof, even without logic. The next morning, James woke up. He looked at the nightstand, and saw the paper. He picked it up with trembling hands, read it, and read it again. He didn't say anything, but something invisible passed through his eyes, like a seed falling into dry soil. He didn't mention it to Ruth, but that night, before sleeping, he whispered to himself. He sent out his word. It was as if he were testing the phrase, as if he needed to feel its taste in his mouth, as if that verse could open a new space inside his chest. The next day, Ruth noticed something strange. James didn't ask for a sedative. He accepted the food without refusing, and when she entered the room, he was wide awake, looking at the paper. "Did you like the verse?" she asked. He took a while to answer, but finally said, "Maybe. There's still something holding me here." And for the first time in days, Ruth truly smiled, because it wasn't healing. It wasn't a miracle. It was just a sentence, but it was enough. Because sometimes, heaven speaks with one line, and that's all we need to keep breathing. On the morning of the 7th day of hospitalization, Ruth entered the room, even before the nurses. She brought coffee in a thermos, a set of clean clothes, and a smile that was still learning to return. James was awake, but not just awake, he looked present. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," he replied. Looking straight at her, Ruth noticed something in his eyes. It wasn't healing, but it wasn't defeat either. It was as if a breath had rekindled a candle that was about to go out, and that simple good morning was worth more than any medical report. On the nightstand, the paper with the psalm was folded. James held it gently, like someone protecting something fragile. Sacred, this verse. There's something about it, he murmured. I know, Ruth replied. It doesn't feel like it talks to us. It feels like it talks from inside us. They remained silent for a few seconds, but it was a good silence, different from the silence of days before, which weighed like stone. This one was light, almost full, as if the room had been visited by something unseen. Later, Ruth stepped out to stretch her legs. While walking through the corridors, something made her stop in the hospital's small break room. It was a simple space, with worn-out couches, a coffee machine, and a few old magazines. But what caught her attention was a bookshelf against the wall. Among dusty novels and encyclopedias, there was a row of forgotten Bibles. She picked one up. The cover was blue, a bit torn. She flipped through without thinking, and the page opened. Exactly on Psalm 107, she froze. It was as if the book itself had chosen to open there, as if it was saying, "You are in the right place, at the right time." She read verse 20 again. He sent out his word and healed them, and delivered them from death. But this time, it wasn't just reading. It was an answer. It was confirmation. She didn't cry, but she felt her throat tighten. That phrase, repeated so many times in recent days, now seemed to pulse, as if it had life, as if it had sound. Ruth closed the Bible, placed it back on the shelf, and left the room holding something invisible, but powerful. When she returned to the room, James was napping. She left her coat on the armchair, sat down slowly, and picked up the paper with the verse. She wrote something on the back of it, in her cursive handwriting, steady, like a silent promise. This word was sent, and it will not return empty. She folded the paper again, and placed it under James's pillow, gently, like someone planting an invisible seed. Later that afternoon, James woke up from a brief nap with his eyes moist. He had dreamed, didn't remember exactly what it was about, but he knew there had been a song, a melody that cradled his sleeping body, like a prayer in chords. He didn't tell Ruth, he simply said, "Today, it doesn't feel like I'm dying." "That's because you're not," she replied with conviction. And then, without planning it, as if both knew exactly what to do, they repeated together, in unison, "He sent out his word, and healed them, and delivered them from death." It was the first time James spoke the verse with faith, not as a test, not as a doubt, but as someone who signs a spiritual contract. Ruth squeezed his hand. They remained silent, but that silence now was sacred. The next morning, the head nurse noticed something unusual on the monitor. The heartbeat was more stable. The oxygen level was better, and James had slept through the night. "Looks like we have a silent miracle happening in here," she said. Ruth smiled, not because she believed healing would come at that exact moment, but because, for the first time, she knew something greater had begun. It wasn't the end, it was the middle of a story written by heaven. Later, while James slept, Ruth sat by the window in the room. The sunlight hit the opposite wall, creating a golden reflection. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Lord, if this word was sent, then sing over him, sing inside him." And it was in that moment, with her heart vulnerable and her faith standing for the first time, that the song began. The first note didn't come from an instrument, it came from the Spirit. James didn't know if he was dreaming or awake, but he heard a gentle melody, as if someone was singing inside him, a calm voice that had no face but had weight. It wasn't loud nor sad, it was like a promise, in harmony. On the outside, Ruth held the folded paper with the verse. Sitting by the bedside, she whispered softly, "Sing, Lord, sing over him." The room was silent, but inside James a song began to be born.
In the silence of the room, he arrived among tests and sighs. He breath in the air. Do not fear, I came to restore you. Even when everything says there's no more way, even when pain settles in the chest, the word came without making a sound and began to heal what no one could see. Heaven moves when faith whispers, and where hope ends, He begins. Even without feeling, even without understanding, the promise had already started to unfold. He sent out His word and healed me, lifted me up when hope faded away. Even in the shadows, He found me. With His promise, He reached me. I heard the voiceless voice, only the heart. Through tears I felt His hand. I touched the song like breathing air, and weary faith came back to me. He sent out His word and healed them and delivered them from death. Psalm 107, verse 20, the promise was sent to me. He sent out His word and healed me. Even without seeing, my spirit sang. In the dark valley, He found me, and with His love, He restored me. It was sent, it touched me. I believe, I receive, I live the word healed.
James opened his eyes. There was no more music in the air, but the echo still vibrated within. He couldn't explain it, but something had been unlocked. Ruth noticed. His eyes were moist, but alive, as if a presence had crossed the room, taken residence, and left light behind. "Did you hear that?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "I heard it, inside me." She smiled. That was the confirmation, the answer that didn't come in the chapel, the sign that didn't arrive through human words. The song was the proof that the word had been sent, that it had crossed diagnoses, reports, statistics, and doubts, and now it lived inside James. From that day on, he began to repeat the verse every morning, not as a ritual, but as a seed, because he knew the healing had already begun, even if it couldn't yet be seen, even if the tests didn't show it. It was invisible, but alive, like a song that echoes, even after silence. That morning, James woke up different. It wasn't a visible improvement. There was no euphoria, no medical announcement, but there was peace. He looked at the white hospital ceiling, as he had done so many times, and for the first time in many days, he didn't feel like closing his eyes again. He wanted to stay. He wanted to live what was beginning inside. The song still echoed in his memory like a breeze. Fragments came to mind, repeatedly. Like choruses, the soul didn't want to forget, even without deserving, even without understanding. He reached me. James slowly reached under the pillow, pulling out the paper with Psalm 107-20, folded, a bit crumpled, but still intact, and now, invincible. He read it silently, like someone reading a letter left by someone they love. He sent out his word and healed them, and delivered them from death. He took a deep breath, placed the paper over his chest, and closed his eyes. At that moment, Ruth walked in. She brought a small bouquet of flowers, the same one she insisted on replacing every day. But seeing James like that, with his eyes closed and hand over his chest, she felt a chill. "James," she called, fearing the worst. He opened his eyes slowly and smiled. "Today, I dreamed of light. There was no pain, just sound, and it was good." She came closer, touched his face tenderly. "Is the music still with you?" "It is, and it's not just the music. It feels like I found someone again, who God, or maybe, my faith." Ruth sat beside him and held his hand lovingly. They stayed like that for a few minutes. No need for words, because everything that needed to be said had already been sung. The nurse came in shortly after. She stopped in front of the monitor and furrowed her brow. "Strange," she said, looking at the vital signs. "Is everything okay?" Ruth asked, worried. "More than okay. Stable, breathing better. The heart is beating more regularly." She looked at James, then at Ruth. "I don't know what you two are doing, but keep doing it." Ruth smiled softly, because she knew it hadn't been a medicine. It hadn't been a machine. It had been the word. Later, James asked for something that surprised Ruth. "Would you pray with me?" She held back tears, held his hand tightly, and the two closed their eyes. She began with simple words, no fancy phrases, just said what her heart felt. "God, thank you for not giving up on him. Thank you for still singing over us, even when the world only screams diagnosis. Thank you because your word arrived. ... And when it arrives, everything begins to change." James added, "Lord, I have no strength, but I have faith, and if you sent this word, then also send what comes after it, the healing, the hope, the continuation of our story." They opened their eyes, and for a moment, everything felt lighter. Even the room seemed brighter, not by magic, but because there was light within. From that day on, James made a point of repeating the psalm. Every day, out loud. It was his ritual, his anchor, his personal prayer. He sent out his word, and healed them, and delivered them from death. It was like a shield, like a reminder, like a spiritual seal saying, "It's not over yet." In the hospital halls, staff began to notice the difference. The man in room 108, who until then seemed to be declining, now smiled. He asked nurses names, and sometimes even hummed softly. Ruth, in turn, was blooming. She walked the halls again with her shoulders lifted. She brought books, flowers, notes, and played soft music on her phone in the background. It was as if the room had become an altar, as if that space, marked by so much pain, had been consecrated. That Sunday, while watching the sunset through the window, James said something unexpected. "Even if I don't leave this place, I've already been healed." Ruth turned, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Because now I know that pain does not have the final word. That death does not have the final word, not even medicine. The one who has the final word is the one who sent it first." She rested her head on his shoulder and replied, "And he has already sent it." The discharge didn't come that week, nor the next. But something in James had already returned home. Faith. His body still faced difficult days. Some test results fluctuated. The clinical diagnosis was still present in the chart. But inside him, there was something no report could measure. It was as if the psalm was alive, breathing with him, teaching him to see beyond what the eyes could see. Every morning, Ruth read the verse out loud. He sent out his word, and healed them, and delivered them from death. And every night, before sleeping, James would repeat it, almost like a song. "This word is still with me." The nurses, once discreet, now stopped to listen. Some asked where that phrase came from. Ruth started writing the psalm on small papers and leaving them at the water cooler, on the chapel bulletin board, inside books from the library. What was once a verse became a chain, a living word passed from hand to hand. And then, on a clear Saturday, the unexpected happened. The doctor entered the room with the chart in hand and said, "James, today's tests don't match the previous ones." James and Ruth looked at each other. "What do you mean, doctor?" The inflammation dropped drastically. The body's response is off the charts. "We're not talking about a miracle, of course," he said, hesitantly. But before he could continue, James smiled and added, "But we are." The doctor smiled, slightly embarrassed. "All I can say is, something has changed, and it's working." Ruth held back tears. James closed his eyes and whispered. The word did not return empty. That afternoon, Ruth asked the staff to play music in the room. The same song James had heard in his heart days earlier. The gentle melody filled the air, and each chord seemed to confirm, where the word enters, nothing stays the same. James remained hospitalized for 2 more weeks, and was released to finish treatment at home. The news spread among patients and staff. The man of the psalm was going home. But before leaving, James asked for something unusual. He handwrote the verse and taped it to the inside of the room's closet. A simple paper, written with a firm hand, Psalm 107-20. He sent out his word, and healed them, and delivered them from death. Below, he added, "If you are reading this, know that you're still alive, and that is already the beginning." On the day of discharge, Ruth pushed the wheelchair to the reception desk. James, with the discharge envelope in his hand, stopped before the door. He looked back and whispered, "Thank you for staying." She squeezed his hand and said, "It was the word that held us." When they got home, they found Ruth's old Bible on the table. She opened it, without aiming for a specific passage, and the page fell exactly on Psalm 107. They both smiled. James started reading that psalm every day, not out of superstition, but because now he knew it wasn't just a sentence. It was a key, a bridge, a song disguised as text. And every time fear tried to return, he would repeat, he sent out his word, and let it do the rest. Months went by. James recovered, beyond expectations, but he knew the greatest miracle wasn't in the body, it was in the soul. Because the word didn't just heal him, it brought him back to who he was, to God, to hope. And now, this word needs to keep moving, because maybe today, it needs to reach you. God, we thank you, because even when all reports say there's nothing more to be done, you still have a word, one that heals, one that reaches, one that crosses walls, hospital rooms, silent tears, and rests in the right heart. Thank you because you still send your word, and it never arrives late. It always finds what needs to be restored, and where it enters, the impossible begins to collapse. Amen. If this word spoke to you, write in the comments, "The word was sent," or write the name of someone you wish this healing would reach. 2. Maybe, like James, someone is waiting for a sign, and your comment might be that beginning. Share this video with someone who needs it, because today, once again, the word was sent.